Welcome to the Garden Talk podcast, where we interview growers from all over the world, both beginners and experts, seeking to learn more about what they know about gardening and how they do things in their garden. What's up, everybody? For those of you that don't know me, my name is Chris, aka Mr. Grow It, and you're tuned into the Garden Talk podcast. This is episode number 169. In this episode, I interview Preston Smith. He has been gardening for 15 years and has a wealth of knowledge when it comes to natural farming, which is the focus of today's discussion. Preston shares insights to his current farm practices and dives into topics such as increasing soil organic matter, composting, leaf mold, JADAM microbial solution, and much more. If you want to see short clips of these podcast episodes, search Garden Talk Clips on YouTube. I also have a gardening channel where I show the plants that I grow. Both of those channels will be linked down in the YouTube description section below. One of my goals for this podcast is to bring free information about gardening to the general public. That being said, I'd like to thank the sponsors of today's episode who helped make that goal possible. Thanks to AC Infinity for sponsoring this episode. Check out their Cloud Ray Gen 2 oscillating clip fan. Their next-gen clip fan has been re-engineered to provide a long-lasting motor and customizable airflow for all stages of your plant's growth cycle. It features 10 speeds and 10 dynamic wind modes to simulate outdoor airflow and links with UIS controllers for Wi-Fi app control. Click the link in the description section below so you can learn more about their Cloud Ray clip fans, and the discount code MrGrowIt15 works on both Amazon and their website, acinfinity.com. Stash Blend. Several additives in one blend, so you no longer have to buy individual bottles. Check it out at stashblend.com, link in the description section below, and use the discount code THESTASH. Spider Farmer. Check out their DWC hydroponics grow system. Each bucket has a 7-gallon capacity made from corrosion-resistant material. The triangular cover design makes adding nutrients and measuring pH levels easy. It has a water level indicator so you can see when you need to refill. It includes an 8-watt air pump, has a top drip design, and comes with air stones to oxygenate the water. More information is linked in the description section below, and discount code MrGrowIt5 works on both Amazon and their website, spider-farmer.com. And we are back, and I'm joined with Preston Smith. How you doing today?
Doing well, thanks. Good to be here, Chris.
Happy to have you on. You were requested by, I don't know who it is. Sometimes I get requests in the comment section, like, you got to have Preston Smith on. He is so knowledgeable when it comes to KNF, JADAM, just natural farming in particular, and applying it not just on a small scale, but a medium or a larger scale. And I'm eager to kind of dig in to learn more about you, what you've been doing on your farm recently, and really some of the techniques that you go through in order to grow your plants. But first, can we do an introduction? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into gardening?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me. Super stoked to be here and share with all your listeners. These are topics I'm super passionate about. My start in agriculture, really regenerative, more as a lifestyle really than just an occupation or anything else. I would say that started back in about 2008, 2009. I had kind of a past life as a draftsman. I worked a desk job, worked for an architectural firm, so was really into kind of systems thinking and coming up with blueprints. Well, for those that remember that year, there was a collapse of the economy. The construction industry was really bad. I found myself without a career, and at the time it was kind of, it was a tragedy, but, turned out to be a course correction in my life for me, a window of opportunity to basically venture into a completely new field and occupation, literally a field. Long story short, back then there was this feeling of like, wow, like the economy collapsed. What do I do now? And so it just felt really like this is, these systems in society are not working. They're collapsing. And so how do we live like more regeneratively, more sustainably, more in tune with nature? And that really put me on the path. And so I had the opportunity to move out to Humboldt County, California in 2011. My sister lived out there, her and her husband. They had a family out there, and specifically my brother-in-law offered me an opportunity to come and work with medicinal plants, get a job on a farm out there. And so I took that opportunity, and that really started a whole kind of chapter of awakening in my life, you might say, that led me into, wild crafting, spending a lot of time in the forest. I took some herbalism courses and learned a lot. Found myself living in the Lost Coast for a season in Humboldt County, and lived in an army tent, so lived off grid. So you're kind of forced to learn how to be sustainable and live off the land in that kind of settings. So wild crafting, foraging for mushrooms, plants, using medicinal trees. So that was all kind of within the permaculture realm. So it kind of led me down that rabbit hole, which led me into Korean natural farming, and just the whole regenerative farming in general is a large, broad umbrella. I mean, there's so many different methodologies even under regenerative farming. And so I've never felt married to any one of those. So for me, it's always been looking for the principles behind them all and universal languages, because I'm sure you've noticed, and a lot of your listeners have noticed, within Korean natural farming, there's all these acronyms. Within biodynamics, you have all these acronyms. Within syntropic agroforestry, they use a lot of terminology, and permaculture has its own terminology. So, and then you get into the soil food web and microbiology, and so it could be all really complex, but if we're distilling it down into principles, it kind of makes it a lot easier to approach, and we can see where there's overlaps instead of differences, instead of language that is creating division and technical kind of groupy, areas where we're siloing information. It becomes way more inclusive that way. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Went down that rabbit hole. It took me up into Oregon. Consulting for farms in medicinal settings in hemp fields. Did 10 acres of hemp with Korean natural farming in JADAM, using some permaculture techniques. Along the way, I've worked in indoors, greenhouses, outdoors, from a 5-lighter in my garage to, like I said, 10 acres in Oregon. So kind of a vast array of different settings that I got to practice and learn from all of these different, settings.
That's so cool. Yeah, it sounds like you've gotten a lot of experience over the past 15 years doing all sorts of things. And yeah, I could totally relate to what you mean by confusing with all the different acronyms. I think that a lot of my audience kind of falls in the trap of, oh, what's this, that? And then they get so frustrated because they don't really know, and then they just don't do things. One of the things I noticed that with your YouTube channel, you make things real easy with the explanations, and I'm excited for this episode because we're going to go through a lot of things that I'm sure that my audience is confused on, and you'll be able to explain them in a beginner-friendly manner that people will be able to understand. So
yeah, I'd love to get into that. Awesome.
Cool. Maybe let's start with your farm. Can you kind of give us a rundown of what you've been doing recently on your farm? Absolutely.
So I kind of explained the history of kind of going up through the Pacific Northwest. But as fate would have it, it kind of landed me back in Southern California, where I'm originally from, specifically North County, San Diego. I'm in basically a zone 9B, 10A. So we're in a tropical, kind of subtropical. We get some freezes, but not a lot. So we're able to grow a lot of tropical fruit here, which is extremely exciting to me. I've lived in more temperate climates my whole life. So this was a huge opportunity. Like 3 years ago, moving down here, I've just kind of done a deep dive into more tropical, subtropical plants and fruits. And so currently, I've been establishing some different food forests, which has really become my passion, is polyculture food forests. And currently this year, I'm working on a really exciting project. It's 22 acres in North County, San Diego. So It's primarily, its history is an avocado orchard. I would say probably roughly like 8 acres of that is planted with avocados. There's quite a few different citrus trees. It's also been used as a flower market garden, so things like purple pride, some of these high value flowers from market. So we're trying to run with kind of what's already here, but we're also prepping for centropic agroforestry planting on about half an acre. So we've been sourcing a lot of fruit trees for that, plants that we can grow here, like mangoes, even like longan. We just picked up some longans yesterday. Papaya, cherimoya. We have several cherimoya trees that are well established on the property, which is a fruit I absolutely love. So I've just really fell in love with, a lot of these tropical fruits, and it's just a vast kind of rabbit hole of fruit that I wasn't even introduced to until a few years ago. And so that's my current project. We're also implementing more of a traditional kind of market garden. So we are incorporating, annuals in with perennial systems and kind of experimenting with both of those. So offering kind of a wide array of, different polycultures.
That's so cool. Yeah, it sounds like you got so much going on there. In your recent YouTube video, one thing I noticed that you're doing is you've increased the organic matter in your soil, and you've also added a cover crop. Those are kind of like the first steps that you've been doing.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us about some sustainable ways to increase the organic matter in the soil?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you just mentioned is probably my favorite way of adding organic matter. Um, a lot of what permaculture and centropic agroforestry, um, the methodology there is more looking for things that are directly in your ecosystem. So looking for materials that we can use for creating biomass, composting. I like to use a lot of cover crops, as you mentioned. So, clover, alfalfa. Between those two, you have, nitrogen fixation. You also have, phosphorus. Like alfalfa has an affinity for phosphorus mobilizing. So between those two, you're really doing a lot of improvement with the soil. I'm a no-till farmer, but sometimes we have to do a hard reset to create a new planting or switch out a crop or something. So that's the only time I will ever recommend really a till, because it's so damaging to the soil. But if it's already compacted, you have erosion going on, you have a system like a monoculture system you want to swap out, then the tilling really makes sense. So for me, that first succession, because really with centropics, we're thinking about the successional planting. That clover might just be there for the beginning to help, create that biomass, get the nitrogen fixation really going in the soil, get the exudates really pumping down in as photosynthesis is pumping, pushing a lot of those sugars down into the soil, which is teamed with, KNF and JADAM when we're putting IMOs and JADAM microbial solution in the soil. And now we're really building up the life in the soil along with that biomass and getting that nutrient cycling really pumping. So, I mean, that's probably my favorite way to build up the fertility in the soil, the biomass, and organic matter is really growing those cover crops. And we can get more into, support plants and, companion planting. But right off the bat, I'd say get to know the legume family, nitrogen fixing family, Fabaceae. I always say they call it Fabaceae because it's fabulous in the sense that these plants are just amazing. A lot of them are fast growers, vigorous growers, and again, they're nitrogen fixers. So taking that atmospheric nitrogen, the rhizobia bacteria that is symbiotically growing with a lot of these legumes is offering us free nitrogen. So we're producing our own fertilizer in situ on site. We don't have to go to our neighbors or a grocery store down the street, or so you could practice organic farming in a very unsustainable way. You know what I mean? When we get into regenerative and even syntropics, now we're looking at directly in our close vicinity. So trying to do things in situ on site, from animals to, plants that we're growing for those fertilizers.
Makes sense. It must be a big cost savings going that route as well. I can only imagine the amount of money you're saving from doing it the all natural way versus going out and buying synthetic nutrients, for example, which a lot of farms still do to this day, where they're buying chemical fertilizers and they're adding it onto the land and they're killing off their microbial population, and they're just, they're kind of in a rut to where they're relying on these chemical fertilizers in order to grow the crops year after year, when really they can go the alternative route, which is the all natural route, and use resources from your land that's free and then grow plants with that. So
exactly. Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I saw in your video is that you added down compost. And I think a lot of viewers are using compost. There are different types of compost out there. I'd like to know, what type of compost do you recommend and why?
Yeah. So, along with what I was saying was, I like to do things in situ and really create my own amendments, my own inputs, my own fertilizers, my own compost. But it really depends on the scale and the timing. I mean, the context kind of drives everything. So there really isn't a kind of cookie cutter method that I use. It's really all context driven. So for this context, we didn't have much organic matter in the soil here at the farm that I'm currently at. So we had a lot of decomposed granite, sand. So we made the call to source some OMRI organic certified compost, till that into the soil. I mean, really, it's about a 5-year head start. If you think about like being able to grow biomass, chop and drop it, get it all to break down, we're really giving ourselves about 5 years by tilling in, good quality compost into the soil from where we would be if we're just trying to build that up, say with top dressing and again, using mulches and cover crops. So yeah, that's what we decided to do here. I didn't produce all this compost and make it myself to begin with. We brought it in from a local company. It was cow manure, and got a test on that, because one thing I'd say about compost is we really need to trust the source, because whatever those animals are eating, is ultimately going to end up in your finished compost. And a lot of these herbicides, and different chemicals can make it through the digestive tract of cows, of cattle, of livestock. And we want to make sure that doesn't get into our compost either.
It's certainly true when they say not all compost is created equal. So
100%. Well, I mean, I did take Elaine Ingram's course, and she has a very specific method, BioComplete compost. So, because as you said, not all compost is created equal. I go to some of the, landscape supplies around here, and what they're selling as compost is essentially like, wood chips and like sand. And I'm like, where's the organic matter in this? This isn't compost. So yeah, that's kind of that term. I would use that, with a lot of caution and take it with a grain of salt, grain of sand, literally.
So what can viewers look for when they're going out to purchase compost? Some compost does come in a bag. Some are just kind of out in the lot. Is there something in particular they should be looking for in the compost? And also, do you recommend testing of the compost before purchase? So if you can get like a small sample, test it, make sure everything's good, and then go ahead and do a large purchase.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would always recommend organic. I was at the grocery store yesterday. We were sourcing some fruit trees for the orchard, and I was looking at a biodynamic compost. So, I mean, those are things I would look for, obviously organic. And yeah, the testing is really important. So usually if you're interested in getting a test result, you can typically, email or get a hold of somebody in the company to get a test result. Now, sometimes the problem with that is that they are only required to test so often. So, the batch of compost that you got might not be the same test result as a previous batch that was made. So they kind of, that can get tricky. But the company that we use, I talked directly to, they have a PhD, agronomist that works for their company. And, I was able to talk to him directly on the phone, and he offered, a really cool guy offered me the test results and, showed, negligent really amounts of any kind of, harmful glyphosate or anything else. So yeah, I would highly recommend, trying to get a test. If you can, talk to the highest quality control person in that company you can, just to kind of ensure and get to know like get to know what our food was eating, or like our plants food, what its food was eating. You know what I mean? Get to know that kind of down the line where those sources are coming from. Really important.
That's some good advice. Now, you mentioned the word biodynamic, and I have quite a few folks that are beginners here. That's probably the first time they're even hearing of that word. Can you break it down for us? What is that?
Yeah, that's a whole rabbit hole in and of itself. I don't claim to be an expert, but I have studied a little bit into it. Biodynamics was created by a gentleman named Rudolf Steiner, and he's a really interesting character in history. He wasn't a farmer per se. He was more kind of, the way I describe him is a very esoteric kind of a guy that used astrology, that used it's really at its core, I would say it's alchemy applied to agriculture. And so, this was in the early 1900s, and people came to Rudolf Steiner because he was just such a powerful figure in his community on all topics. They asked him for a specific way of farming. And so he came up with biodynamics as an alternative to conventional farming. And so biodynamics, the short answer is that was what he came up with. It encompasses astrological alignments, and there's a series of different inputs. Some of them actually semi-similar to Korean natural farming. I mean, for example, one BD 500 is horn manure. And so what you do is you take manure, you would put that in a horn traditionally, and put that underground for the winter. And so to me, what that is it's a microbial inoculant. By the time you dig that up after a season, after a winter, you now have it completely inoculated with the soil microbiome of that land. And then you take that and you go around and spray that and kind of spread it. But it works in homeopathic ways. Some of them are kind of hard to explain by reductionistic science. So it kind of gets more into some esoteric realms.
That's wild. I had never heard of that. I didn't even know that was a thing. That's so cool to hear. Now, one other thing that I noticed that you do is leaf mold. You utilize leaf mold. Can you talk to us? What is leaf mold? What are the benefits? How do you create it? How do you apply it? So on and so forth.
Yeah, so leaf mold is really a passionate topic. It's really my go-to to really create the foundation of fertility in soil. And so it's really the decomposition of leaves from deciduous trees. And so primarily the fungi that is symbiotic, sometimes not always symbiotic. I mean, there's a whole consortium of different fungus and bacteria, but specifically it's more the fungi that creates this aggregate through a slow, you could call it, you could call it a composting process, because the leaves are decomposing slowly by the fungi that's really eating the lignous material and creating this beautiful soil aggregate, meaning like big clumps of these leaves that are being literally digested by the fungi. And you just see these big webs, big chunk of white mycelial humus in the topsoil. And, so this is used in Korean natural farming and JADAM as a primary means of an inoculant for growing, IMO cultures, for creating JADAM microbial solution. And so the important thing to note is that it's a consortium. We're not looking for a specific type of fungus or whatever. And, whenever I've talked to kind of mushroom growers about IMO, they're always like curious, so what mushroom are you going for? And it doesn't necessarily work that way. We want the consortium. We are mimicking nature. And so we want that diversity. I think you had Chris Trump on the podcast, and he was talking about those DNA tests that were done, over 400 different species of fungi, over 800 bacteria found in some of this. This was IMO cultures cultured from leaf mold, but that's what we're looking for, is really the diversity. There's power in diversity, and a big approach for me in how I practice agriculture is kind of trying to create these diverse systems, these self-regulating systems, by bringing in the healthy cultures, the diversity, and kind of letting nature figure that out for itself. Obviously, like, I'm trained in some microscopy too, so I can look down under a microscope and kind of look for the players involved. But, you don't have to be a scientist or even know how to use a microscope to be really successful at culturing IMOs and using them very effectively in your gardens and on your farm.
That's one thing about culturing on your own, is the diversity is going to be far superior, far more than if you're buying some of these microbial inoculant products on the market. I'm not making a claim they should never use it, never do that, and that they don't work or anything like that, but you're going to get much more diversity going this all natural farming route and kind of culturing your own.
Absolutely, 100%. And I'm not going to knock some of these commercial inoculants. Like, I used some of them back in the day, and specifically to your audience that grows indoors. I did grow an indoor back in the day where I was using IMOs from outside, bringing those in, but that's a careful process. And if you're doing a big scale commercial operation, obviously you got to be careful when you're doing that to really build up the right diversity. So I think that, indoors might make a little more sense for some of these different microbial inoculants that you can buy, kind of bugs in a jug, so to speak. They certainly have some efficacy, but, I would use IMO over those all day long. And here's one big difference between some of these bugs in a jug versus IMOs. IMOs are cultured out in nature versus cultured in a laboratory. And there's a big difference between microbes that are cultured in a community where there's, competition and there's so much diversity that all these players are getting involved. I mean, only the strong literally survive. Whereas in a lab where you're creating a monoculture in a sterile environment, those cultures don't have the competition. They don't have that diversity in nature, which is really kind of what drives the power and strength of a lot of these microorganisms, in my opinion. So I'm not going to say that these store-bought inoculants don't have a place, but for me, I don't buy anything except for a culture that I'm buying to reculture. For example, I take L. reuteri. It's a strain of lactobacillus. It was originally found in mother's breast milk, and so it's a probiotic. And it's there's a lot of new studies on Lactobacillus reuteri, and so I buy the culture for that to take as a probiotic, and I reculture that as a yogurt to take for myself. So, and you can do the same with these, these microbes for applying to, plants and agriculture.
That's awesome. So it sounds like there's multiple ways to kind of get to the finish line.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, for me, it all really starts with the leaf mold. I mean, there's a lot of lactobacillus everywhere on our skin and the air. We can culture that as well, which, labs is a great companion and really great for decomposing organic matter in the soil too. But you also get a lot of that in your IMO cultures. So, yeah.
I'm sure there's got to be some risks and mistakes that can happen when you're creating your own IMO. Can you get into that?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, a specific process for sure. And after about 10 years of making IMO piles, my process has kind of changed a little bit. And I can speak to that. However, what I would say to your original question is, I would say the temperatures that you hold, your IMO pile when you're culturing is really important. You don't want to be, culturing higher than about 130 degrees Fahrenheit. That window between 120 and 130 is pretty optimal to maintain that during the process, which means you'll be turning the pile quite a bit. On the flip side of that, you don't want to disturb the pile too much. Like, there is a balance. Like, you don't want to come in and just turn your pile to where it works a lot like a fire when you're starting a fire. Like, you don't want to extinguish that fire too fast. Like, you really want the microbes to start eating that food supply, which is, basically mill run. So oats, barley, wheat, any of those will work. You mill that down, the carbohydrates, fats, proteins available are going to become a food source. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say that having that optimal temperature, that Goldilocks zone, is really important. And, making sure it doesn't get too wet, too anaerobic. If you got, ammonia smells coming off of your pile, that's a red flag. So yeah, there is kind of a Goldilocks zone kind of sweet spot that you want to stay between when culturing your IMOs.
That's good advice. I appreciate you breaking that down for us so folks are aware. Now, you mentioned you've been creating IMO for 10 years and you've kind of adjusted the way you've been doing over the years. Would you be willing to kind of break down what steps you currently do to create IMO?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just tell this quick story because this is how I came to the current process of how my process has changed a little bit. I was blessed with the opportunity to train directly with the Cho family, Master Han Q Cho, who recently passed away. Rest in peace, Master Han Q Cho. Also, his son, Young Sang Cho, and their family, JADAM Sona, and basically was part of a group that helped to promote a tour around the whole United States with the Cho family. And so I toured with the Cho family. And, so we had an Airbnb out in DC to do an event at Firebird Farms out there, an amazing farm. And we had a workshop out there. And so one night I was hanging out with Cultivating Classics, who makes these awesome shirts. Check him out. Makes gear, IMO gear. And so he was helping with the tour, and we were sitting with Cho Yang Song, and all having a beverage of choice. And basically, he told me the story of kind of how IMO came to be. So Master Cho's original way for culturing, IMO. And that was going through the process of IMO 1, 2, into 3 and 4. And so 1, for listeners that don't know, I think it's been explained on here, maybe by previous guests, but you basically use you cook rice and you go out and you place it in, healthy forests with microbiomes or those healthy ecosystems near you. And you would culture the fungi in that environment, the indigenous microorganisms, bring that back, mix it 1-to-1 with a brown sugar, then you would have IMO 2 in a jar. Now, IMO 2 is really cool because this is like, a cryogenic freeze of that specific year, that time of year, which that fluctuates throughout the year. So you literally have a library of that microbiology from that very moment, and you can keep a whole library of these IMO 2s. So that is one really cool thing about IMO 2. From there, you can take the IMO collections, and the best practice is really to take several of those to grow on a substrate, mill run, reculture that. That gives you IMO 3, and then you would add native soil, reculture it again to make IMO 4. You can take that a step further into IMO 5 by adding, I like to do seaweed, so a nitrogen source. You could use manures for this. But IMO 5 is basically, if you get to that stage, which is a long process to get there. That is your like super amendment. You literally don't really have to add much more than IMO 5 if you get there. Okay, so that being said, simplifying the process, what Youngsang Cho told me was that his father originally, Youngsang Cho, or Hankyu Cho, excuse me, he originally would take leaf mold and directly culture that on a substrate and make, what we consider IMO 3. And then what happened is they were putting together some books, and it was kind of Master Cho's daughter was helping with the recipe writing, and there was a decision made at some point to basically use the extra steps of IMO 1, collecting in a rice box, adding it to sugar, and then creating IMO 3, which adds a lot of steps. So you can do those extra steps if you like, but I kind of just use the leaf mold straight to the substrate now. I think this is also a lot more kind of approachable for people. The more accessible and approachable and kind of less steps involved, I find people naturally stick with it a little more. So the other thing that I do is I love to mill down all of my grains myself rather than just buying a mill run from a feed supply, because we have more control of the food sources, the degree in which we're milling that grain down to make available those carbohydrates, the fats, and everything that grain has inside, all the constituents that these microbes can feed on. So what I do is I'll mill my own grains, which kind of came from a practice. I used to brew a lot of beer back in the day, and so that was I had these mills around and started using it for that. But what I started doing was using some whole grain in my pile, so not milling all of that, but actually leaving some of the whole grain in there. And then I noticed that grain would germinate and sprout, so I'd have these sprouts within my pile. And then I thought, wow, this is something, because now I can actually, if a lot of people might be familiar with sprouted teas for, those enzymes and hormones that you get from doing these sprouted teas. And so that's kind of where my thinking started going with this was, well, if we have some of those sprouts growing in the mix too, now we're increasing like the enzymes and, everything else that comes along with, germination. And so we're adding that to this pile too. And now we really have a super powerful inoculant to either go broadcast or to take further into a liquid IMO, like Chris Trump kind of originally did.
I know there's tons of folks here that are listening in that do the process, and hearing somebody who's done it for 10 years, how they do it, is certainly valuable. So thanks for breaking that down for us.
You're welcome. I also explain that in a lot more detail kind of on my YouTube channel if anybody wants to watch any of those videos.
Sweet. Yeah, I'll definitely have a link to Preston's YouTube channel down in the description section below so people can easily get to it. Now, another potential option that people can do is JADAM microbial solution, JMS. Can you break that down for us? What is it exactly, and kind of how does it differ from IMO?
That's a good question. So JMS is sort of a simplified version for replacing IMO that Youngsang of JADAM came up with. He felt like there's too many kind of steps involved. I think if we take those couple steps out, it makes it a lot more approachable. But you can culture JMS incredibly quick. So basically with potatoes and sea salt, right? And so it's nearly free to brew, and you still use leaf mold, only you're doing it in a culture of water. So it's not aerated. So for the most part, anaerobic, however, not completely anaerobic. It is recommended to really splash when you're cooking the potatoes down. You essentially make like mashed potatoes, and then you can blend that up, and so it's very available starches. And then along with the trace mineral complex that you get from sea salt, now you have this incredible food source for these microorganisms. And as you steep that in a bucket, you really want to get it agitated. So you're splashing a lot of oxygen into the mix. So even though it's not completely like an aerated compost tea with a bubbler rolling, it's not a vortex or anything like that. It's not, a lot of people think that might be just completely anaerobic, and that's not the case. We still get some aerobic culture in there. I would say it's a little more anaerobic, so we might be getting more facultative culture than, say, what you'd get with the IMOs. So I have seen that. So there is a little bit of a difference. And so to kind of explain the difference in how I would use IMO a little bit differently than JMS, even though they're pretty much interchangeable, when I'm first establishing a new grow, say I have a like really compacted soil and maybe you got some erosion going on, JMS is amazing for that. Soaking in JMS, because you really want to soak that in like deep down. Young saying always says jaw, which means like deep down and into the soil, and it can survive in conditions without oxygen. So that's really good at like breaking up hard compacted clay, rock, sand. And so I would start with the JMS first for that situation. Then I would come back, start mulching more. And then before getting ready for a planting, I would be adding the IMOs directly, like before my plantings, during my plantings, and after. And that's kind of dealing more with the aerobic cultures that are in the top, 4 inches of the topsoil. So that's kind of how I differentiate those.
Sounds like it's a lot easier to do JMS than it would be to do the IMO process. I mean, what you mentioned, potatoes and sea salt. That's something that a lot of people just have in their cupboard there, so they can easily kind of get started creating their own JMS solution. Is there a specific type of potato that's better than other, like russet potatoes versus sweet potato? Is there any differences at all there?
It's an interesting question. It's really like what has the most starches, because that's really, what the food source is that we're getting from potatoes. This gets into kind of a really interesting area of optimizing your JMS. And so let's say you're growing strawberries. You could create a JMS by putting potatoes or strictly strawberries into that. And now you're optimizing your microorganisms for that specific crop. So this gets into a really interesting kind of area of application and research, tailoring these microorganisms for the specific crop. So I haven't seen a huge difference. I have used like sweet potatoes before. I would say by adding different food sources, you are, potentially, and I've seen this under a microscope, you are culturing, different strains. Largely, they're going to be similar based on, samples that were taken from the same environment. But this also gets to JADAM, and I guess you could say KNF as well. Typically, you want to be culturing in the same exact environment that you're growing in, because those microorganisms are optimized for those conditions. There's a reason why when I go collect leaf mold under an oak tree that's a 50-year-old oak tree on this property, there's a reason why they're there, because they went through the whole process of evolution and adapting and all of those different variables, from the temperature, humidity, the moisture, all those different variables. These microbes made it through and have adapted and acclimated for literally thousands of years. So they're optimized for that environment. And so that is where you want to be doing your liquid fertilizers, your composting, your JMS. You want to put those barrels right next to the fields you're growing in.
That makes total sense. Now, in regards to application rate, probably majority of the folks that are tuning in are indoor growers. Mm-hmm. And JMS, what would you say is an appropriate application rate? When should they apply? Should it be every week? Should it be every other week, once a month, once a grow? Can you give us some information in regards to that stuff?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's It's variable for sure. It kind of depends on your situation. If we're talking about an indoor, it might be a really good time to condition before, let's say you're, prepping for a new planting and you just added a new soil mix, a new blend. You're getting the structure and your soil, a living soil system, going. JMS is great for that initial inoculation and kind of jump starting that whole process. It's going to help start breaking down all the compost and organic matter in the soil. So that would be a good time to apply it when you're just getting started and just starting to build, that soil food web. I would use it more often. So maybe once a week, for the first couple of months. From that point on, you might do it every month or so. And then once you really get it, those cultures really established, you don't have to apply that often. I'd say maybe, every succession of your planting, I might do another application at that point, maybe just one. So more upfront when you're first developing the soil food web. Oh, and to your point about, application rates, 1 to 30 is a common rate. I mean, so a lot of these, applications work a little differently than, say, like a salt-based fertilizer where we get really specific on the application dose. I mean, we can stay within the recommended ranges, which is always good, but it's not like you don't have to get too worried about like, okay, I did this one at 50 parts as opposed to 30 parts. You might go with a more concentrated, form of the JMS when you're first establishing it. For example, we had a really compacted area outside here where we're doing the centropic rows on half an acre. And what I did is I just soaked it in with water and then I applied JMS straight onto the field. But I did soak it down first with water. But the common rate is 1 part JMS to 30 parts dechlorinated filtered water. That would be a pretty common application. You could go all the way to like 1 to 100. And if you're soaking in first, you could be applying JMS straight. I'd be a little more careful doing that because it's pretty loaded with a lot of microbiology.
Okay. And then only as a soil drench, or do people use it as a foliar spray as well?
JMS more so as a soil drench. You could foliar spray it, but I feel a lot of those kind of facultative anaerobes. I mean, they'll live in the phytosphere as well as the rhizosphere. So yeah, you're gonna get some benefits from foliar spraying as well. If you have say you have some powdery mildew, JMS could be good for combating that. Just like IMO limo T is also good for that.
Awesome. All right. What other simple inputs can indoor growers make at home using either kitchen scraps or easily sourced materials?
I would say fermented plant juices, which we use sugar to osmotically extract all the constituents out of plants, usually just the growth tips that have most of the growth hormones in the plant. The auxins, gibberellic acid is what we're going for, as well as some of the constituents, in that plant. So basically harvesting vigorous weeds that grow around your house, you can utilize those, or your farm, you can utilize those for a fertilizer to make a FPJ, fermented plant juice. Or if you go the JADAM method, you just throw it in water. And so I kind of joke around, like everything in JADAM, you just like throw it in water and putrefy it. Obviously there's more to the system than that. And as mentioned, I think by previous guests, the IMO cultures are 80% of KNF and JADAM. These other inputs that we make are kind of just additives, little extras. They also mimic like exudates with the soil content. I think that's a lot of what FPJ is doing. Other inputs we can make. If you have eggshells, you can make water-soluble calcium. If you have bones, you can make cal phos. Those are made with extractions of vinegar. Um, so, those are really great to make as well. What else do we have? Brown rice vinegar is another input in Korean natural farming. I do culture some of my own brown rice vinegar. That gets a little involved. That's a 3-step fermentation process. So that's a little bit more involved in, Master Cho doesn't really teach, never really taught BRV for the most part that I'm aware of. So kind of found those recipes on my own. But yeah, those would be some good ones you can make. I also do a lot of vermicomposting with kitchen scraps. I have a worm tower right outside my kitchen door. So I just toss a lot of my food scraps in there, give it to the worms.
Awesome. Yeah, it gives the audience some options. They can do some Googling and research anything that interests them, and they can learn more how to do that process.
Absolutely.
Now, how about for pest control? A lot of people want to really go the all-natural route when it comes to controlling pests or preventing pests. What are some best KNF or JADAM pest control solutions for indoor gardens?
Yeah, it's a great question. So with the KNF side, it's there's not a whole lot of pesticides that we make in the KNF system. It's more preventative measures, and those preventative measures are really built in the diversity that we're building, first of all, in the soil with the microbiome. And so we're building a lot of resistance on our plants with the higher Brix level that is created through these cultures of IMO. And then we can use bioremediation, like labs is a good one to combat like mildew and things like that. In the phytosphere, even in the soil. And then JADAM has a lot more to offer on the side of our pesticides. So JADAM teaches how to make a horticultural soap, a wetting agent. And then with that, you can team that soap with many different herbal extractions the sky is the limit with different extractions that you can use with the horticultural soap. One of my favorites when I was in Humboldt County was using the California bay laurel. Introduced that to the natural farming community years ago because I was studying herbalism and found that the Native Americans of that region use the bay laurel, which has this really fragrant, super high essential oil content in the leaves. It's just very powerful. And the Native Americans would take it and they would protect some of the acorn meal they were making. They would surround it with the bay laurel to keep pests away. And I was reading about that, that could be used in JADAM as a pesticide. And so I started distilling bay laurel leaves and found that the essential oils are great for aphids. They really effective on aphids. Successfully took care of a huge infestation of aphids on a hemp crop in Oregon, and had a lot of other friends doing pretty large scale stuff using the bay laurel with a lot of positive results. I mean, basically within 99% of the community of aphids was destroyed in 2 applications.
That's super interesting to me. Bay laurel is it's around here a lot, and I was considering putting them in as privacy bushes, so I didn't realize that they could have other uses for me. So that's really exciting to me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing tree up in Oregon. It's Oregon myrtle wood, and they have a different name. My ex-girlfriend, who was an herbalist, used to joke around with me. No, it's Oregon myrtlewood, and I'd say no, it's California bay laurel, and we were both right.
So I imagine all of these things when it comes to natural farming, a lot of folks, they're afraid that they're going to make mistakes. And I'd like to go over some of the common mistakes that new growers make when trying to implement some of these permaculture techniques. Can you break it down for us? Maybe some of the things, maybe top 2 or 3 that come to your mind of mistakes that new folks make and how they can be avoided or corrected?
Well, the biggest one that comes to mind for me is, living soil systems, regenerative farming systems that were emulating natural processes. They take time. And so I know we kind of live in an instant gratification modern culture. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest ones is that we need to be patient and enjoy the process. It's okay to learn through our failures, our mistakes, and those just make us better the next times around. And so I would say that's probably one of the biggest ones. It's the old story of the moral of the tortoise and the hare. It's better to be slow and effective and efficient than fast and hasty. And so I think with the regenerative farming methods, take the tortoise's example there and be patient with the process. And other mistakes, the companion plants are a big one when it comes to permaculture and syntropic agroforestry. That was a big one for me, was learning how important the companion plants are to that system, because those are more systems approaches. We're looking more at ecology rather than just like a monoculture. We're focused on the system. So really focusing more on the system and those support plants and how important they are to cycle, nutrients into the system, not just looking at, our target crop. We're literally growing our own, fertilizers with syntropic agroforestry. It's more of a principle-based method than an input-based method.
Yeah, I'm sure we can get much, much deeper into so many different aspects of things: cover crops, companion planting, mulch layers, syntropic agroforestry. I'd like to invite you back on for a part 2 at some point in the future if you'd be willing to get into some of these things deeper. Coming up towards the end of the podcast here, so I'd like to wrap things up. But yeah, if you're down for a part 2 at some point in the future, not only me would enjoy it, but I know my audience would enjoy it as well.
Absolutely, I would love to. Yeah, I mean, we didn't really touch on syntropics, and there's so much there. It's an incredible way to farm, and I think it does have some application in indoors too. Looking at plant consortiums and those intervals that we can plant in. So I'd love to come back.
Awesome. So we'll plan for that. Okay, let's wrap things up here. Can you tell the listeners how they can find you, and is there anything upcoming in the future that you want to talk about?
Yeah, sure. I am Rogue Regenerative Agriculture on YouTube. I have an Instagram, Rogue Regeneration. And then my website is roguenaturalfarming.com. There's some information, and I try to keep that update with kind of current projects. I do offer some CANF inputs. I don't, my goal isn't to be a fertilizer salesman at all. My labels say, make your own first and supplement second. So I don't often, sometimes I'm slow to even get those orders out, and it's really seasonal, but I do offer some of those on the website. And then also lifesourcefarms.net is the farm that I currently work at. We're launching a new platform to sell our produce that's regeneratively harvested. We'll have avocado boxes available very soon and much more. So that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Well, I'll definitely have a link to Preston's YouTube channel down in the YouTube description section below. And if you have any questions in regards to this, or if you want to let us know what inputs you use, let us know down in the comments section below. The people being scrolled on the screen right now are on the producer tier on Patreon. Special thanks to you. Patreon.com/MrGrowit. 100% of what is donated through there goes right back into the podcast. So thank you so much for your contribution. Preston, once again, thanks so much for coming on. Just hearing what seems like a small piece of your knowledge has been very valuable to me, and I'm sure it's very valuable to my audience as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me today, speak for an hour.
Absolutely. A privilege to be here, Chris. Thanks for the opportunity. Can't wait to talk some more.
All right, we'll leave it at that. Thanks so much. I'll catch y'all in the next episode. Peace out.